Marcus stood perfectly still at his post outside the grand palace gates, his polished armor gleaming under the morning sun. The other royal guards nearby whispered among themselves, casting sideways glances at the quiet young man who had joined their ranks just 3 months ago. Unlike the others who boasted about their combat skills and family connections, Marcus rarely spoke and kept to himself. The palace courtyard buzzed with activity as servants hurried past carrying supplies for the upcoming royal celebration. Captain Reginald, a burly man with graying temples and countless battle scars, approached the line of guards with his usual stern expression. His heavy boots echoed against the stone pavement as he inspected each soldier's uniform and posture. "Today we practice formation drills," Captain Reginald announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "The king expects perfection during tomorrow's ceremony. Any guard who fails to meet standards will face consequences." The other guards straightened their shoulders and adjusted their weapons. Thomas, a loud and arrogant guard who came from a wealthy merchant family, smirked as he looked at Marcus. "I wonder if our silent friend here even knows how to hold a sword properly," he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. Several guards chuckled, and Marcus felt their eyes boring into him. He had endured their mockery for weeks now, always choosing to remain silent rather than defend himself. The truth was far more complicated than any of them could imagine. But Marcus had learned long ago that sometimes the best strategy was to let others underestimate you. Captain Reginald led the group to the training grounds, a large open area behind the palace where guards practiced their skills daily. The space was surrounded by high stone walls decorated with the royal family's coat of arms. Wooden practice dummies stood in neat rows, their surfaces scarred from countless sword strikes and spear thrusts. "Form ranks," Captain Reginald shouted, and the guards quickly arranged themselves in 3 neat lines. Marcus took his position in the back row, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his sword. The weapon felt familiar in his grip, like an old friend he had known for years. Thomas positioned himself directly in front of Marcus, his expensive armor polished to mirror brightness. He turned around with a mocking grin. "Try to keep up, farm boy," he whispered. "We wouldn't want you embarrassing the entire guard unit." The first drill involved basic sword movements, overhead strikes, defensive blocks, and lateral cuts. Captain Reginald demonstrated each motion slowly, his weathered hands moving with practiced precision. "Remember, these movements must become second nature. In real combat, hesitation means death." As the guards began practicing, Marcus moved through the motions with careful deliberation. He deliberately slowed his movements and occasionally stumbled slightly, maintaining the appearance of an inexperienced recruit. The other guards noticed his apparent clumsiness and exchanged knowing looks. "Look at him," whispered Gerald, another guard who stood nearby. "He moves like he's never held a sword before in his life. How did he even pass the entrance examination?" Thomas laughed quietly. "Probably bribed someone. His family must have connections we don't know about. There's no other explanation for why someone so incompetent would be allowed to guard the royal family." Captain Reginald walked among the guards, correcting stances and adjusting grip positions. When he reached Marcus, he paused and frowned. "Your form needs work, recruit. Keep your elbow higher and maintain better balance." Marcus nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir. I'll practice more." "See that you do," the captain replied curtly before moving on to the next guard. The morning continued with increasingly complex drills. The guards practiced formation changes, coordinated attacks, and defensive maneuvers. Marcus continued his careful performance, appearing to struggle with movements that should have been simple for any trained soldier. During a brief water break, the guards gathered in small groups to discuss their progress. Marcus stood alone near the water barrel, quietly observing the conversations around him. He noticed how each guard revealed their strengths and weaknesses through casual boasting and complaints. Thomas approached with several other guards following behind him. "Tell me, Marcus," he said with fake concern, "have you considered finding a different profession? Perhaps something that doesn't require actual skill or courage?" The group erupted in laughter, and Marcus simply shrugged. "I'm here to serve the royal family," he replied quietly. "That's all that matters to me." "Serving requires competence," Thomas shot back. "What happens when real danger threatens the palace? Will you hide behind the rest of us while we risk our lives?" Marcus met his gaze steadily. "I'll do whatever is necessary to protect the kingdom." His calm response seemed to irritate Thomas even more. "We'll see about that," he muttered, before walking away with his followers. As the training session resumed, Captain Reginald announced they would practice sparring matches. "Pair up," he commanded. "Show me what you've learned." Marcus found himself matched against Gerald, who grinned confidently. "Don't worry," Gerald said as they took their positions. "I'll go easy on you." The two guards circled each other with wooden practice swords raised. Gerald attacked first, launching a series of quick strikes that Marcus deflected with apparent difficulty. He stumbled backward, his movements looking awkward and uncoordinated. "Is that the best you can do?" Gerald taunted, pressing his advantage. "My grandmother fights better than you." Marcus continued his performance, allowing Gerald to push him around the practice area while the other guards watched and laughed. He absorbed their mockery silently, filing away every detail about their fighting styles and weaknesses for future reference. When the sparring match ended with Gerald's easy victory, Thomas clapped slowly and sarcastically. "Magnificent display, Marcus. Truly inspiring." Captain Reginald shook his head in disappointment. "Recruit Marcus, report to the armory after training. You'll spend extra hours practicing basic forms until you improve." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the guards returned to their regular duties. Marcus resumed his position at the palace gates, standing motionless while the others continued their whispered comments about his poor performance. What none of them knew was that Marcus had been carefully studying every aspect of the palace's defenses, memorizing guard rotations, identifying weak points, and observing the daily routines of everyone from servants to senior officials. His apparent incompetence was a carefully crafted disguise that allowed him to gather information without drawing suspicion. As evening approached and the first day of training concluded, Marcus reflected on how perfectly his plan was working. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but he was exactly where he needed to be. The other guards had completely dismissed him as a threat, which gave him a significant advantage in achieving his true objective. The next morning brought gray clouds and a cold wind that swept across the palace grounds. Marcus arrived early for training, finding the courtyard empty except for a few servants preparing for the day's activities. He used this quiet time to examine the palace's eastern wall more closely, noting the spacing between guard towers and the patrol patterns he had observed over the past weeks. Captain Reginald appeared shortly after sunrise, his mood even more serious than usual. "Today's ceremony is crucial," he announced as the guards assembled. "Foreign dignitaries will be present, including ambassadors from 3 neighboring kingdoms. Any mistake could have diplomatic consequences." Thomas and his group of followers exchanged confident glances. They had spent the previous evening at a tavern, boasting about their important roles in protecting such distinguished guests. Marcus had overheard their loud conversation while walking past the establishment, learning valuable details about the ceremony's security arrangements. "We'll begin with synchronized formation drills," Captain Reginald continued. "The guards must move as one unit during the processional. There's no room for individual error." The guards arranged themselves in perfect rows, their armor and weapons creating an impressive display of military precision. Marcus took his usual position in the back. Knowing that his placement there was intentional, Captain Reginald wanted to minimize any potential embarrassment from the weakest member of the unit. As they began the complex sequence of movements, Marcus continued his careful performance of mediocrity. He lagged slightly behind the others during turns, appeared to struggle with the timing of weapon presentations, and occasionally bumped into the guard beside him. Each mistake drew frustrated sighs from Captain Reginald and muffled laughter from his fellow guards. "Marcus," the captain barked after the 3rd repetition, "you're disrupting the entire formation. Pay attention to the rhythm." "Sorry, sir," Marcus replied, looking genuinely embarrassed. "I'll try harder." Gerald shook his head in disgust. "How are we supposed to look professional with him stumbling around behind us? The foreign ambassadors will think our entire military is incompetent." During a brief rest period, Marcus overheard Thomas discussing the afternoon's schedule with several other guards. "The ceremony begins at 2 o'clock, Thomas explained importantly. "We'll escort the ambassadors from the main gate to the throne room, then maintain positions throughout the feast." "What about security in other parts of the palace?" asked another guard. "Minimal," Thomas replied dismissively. "Most guards will be focused on the ceremony. Only essential posts will remain staffed." Marcus absorbed this information while pretending to struggle with his equipment. The conversation confirmed what he had suspected. The ceremony would provide the perfect distraction for his real mission. While everyone's attention was focused on the formal proceedings, he would have unprecedented access to areas of the palace that were normally heavily guarded. The morning training session continued with individual weapon demonstrations. Each guard was required to showcase their skills with sword, spear, and crossbow before Captain Reginald and a panel of senior officers who had arrived to evaluate their readiness. Thomas performed first, executing a flawless series of sword techniques that earned approving nods from the observers. His movements were precise and powerful, demonstrating years of expensive private training. He finished with a complex spinning maneuver that drew scattered applause from the watching guards. "Excellent work," Captain Reginald commented. "You'll take point position during the processional." Several other guards followed with equally impressive displays. Gerald showed particular skill with the crossbow, hitting targets at increasingly difficult angles. Another guard named Robert demonstrated spear techniques that would have been deadly in actual combat. When Marcus's turn arrived, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. The watching officers prepared themselves for disappointment, while the other guards barely concealed their amusement. Marcus approached the weapon rack with apparent nervousness, selecting a practice sword that he examined as if unfamiliar with its weight and balance. "Begin when ready," Captain Reginald said with resignation. Marcus started with basic overhead strikes, his movements deliberate and clumsy-looking. He swung too hard at first, nearly losing his balance, then overcorrected with strikes that were too weak and poorly aimed. The watching guards began whispering among themselves, their voices carrying clearly across the training ground. "This is painful to watch," someone muttered. "How did he even survive basic training?" another voice added. Marcus continued his performance, occasionally glancing toward the observers with apparent embarrassment. He could see the disappointment on Captain Reginald's face and the barely contained laughter from his fellow guards. The senior officers looked uncomfortable, clearly wondering how such an incompetent recruit had been assigned to royal guard duty. After completing the required sword techniques with consistent mediocrity, Marcus moved to the spear demonstration. He approached the weapon as if it were an alien object, taking several moments to find a comfortable grip. His first thrust was wildly off target, missing the practice dummy entirely and nearly striking a wooden post. "Careful," Captain Reginald shouted. "Control your weapon." "Yes, sir," Marcus replied, adjusting his stance with exaggerated concentration. The spear work continued with similar results: missed targets, poor form, and obvious inexperience. By the time Marcus reached the crossbow portion of the demonstration, the watching officers were checking their pocket watches and exchanging meaningful looks. Marcus had never seen a crossbow before in his life, he made his performance suggest. He struggled to load the bolt properly, requiring assistance from an increasingly frustrated Captain Reginald. When he finally fired, the bolt flew harmlessly over the target and embedded itself in the ground 20 feet away. "That's enough," Captain Reginald said firmly. "Report to the quartermaster for additional equipment inspection. We'll discuss your development after the ceremony." As Marcus walked away from the demonstration area, he could hear the whispered conversations behind him. The consensus was clear. He was the weakest guard in the unit's history, a liability who somehow needed to be managed through the afternoon's important ceremony without causing any significant problems. What the observers didn't notice was how Marcus had used the demonstration to study their reactions, learn about their priorities, and gather intelligence about the palace's security protocols. Every mistake had been calculated to reinforce their perception of him while providing opportunities to observe details that would be crucial for his real mission. The afternoon ceremony was approaching quickly, and Marcus felt a familiar surge of anticipation. Years of careful planning had led to this moment, and everything was falling into place exactly as he had hoped. The other guard's contempt for his abilities was about to become his greatest advantage. During the lunch break, Marcus sat alone in the guard's common room, while the others clustered together at distant tables. He could hear fragments of their conversations, complaints about being forced to work with such an incompetent colleague, speculation about how he had obtained his position, and jokes about his performance during the morning's demonstrations. Thomas approached his table with a mocking smile. "I've been thinking about your situation," he said, sitting down uninvited. Maybe you should consider requesting a transfer to a different position, something more suited to your talents. Marcus looked up from his simple meal. What kind of position? Palace gardener, perhaps, Thomas suggested with fake helpfulness. Or maybe kitchen duty. Anything that doesn't involve protecting important people. I'll consider it, Marcus replied quietly. Thomas leaned forward conspiratorially. Between you and me, there are rumors that Captain Reginald is planning to recommend your dismissal after today's ceremony. You might want to start looking for other opportunities. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Thank you for the warning. As Thomas walked away, clearly satisfied with having delivered what he thought was devastating news, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. If only they knew how perfectly their plans aligned with his own objectives. The ceremony couldn't begin soon enough. The great bells of the palace tower chimed twice, signaling that the ceremony would begin within the hour. Marcus stood with the other guards in the armory, making final adjustments to their ceremonial armor. The polished metal reflected the afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows, creating dancing patterns of light across the stone walls. Captain Reginald entered the room carrying a scroll with detailed instructions for the ceremony. His expression was stern as he reviewed the names and assignments written in careful script. Listen carefully, he announced. Each of you has a specific role to play. There can be no confusion or mistakes. The guards straightened to attention as the captain began reading assignments. Thomas and the more experienced guards received positions of honor, escorting the foreign ambassadors, standing beside the throne, and maintaining security at key entrances. Marcus listened carefully as each name was called and each position assigned. Marcus, Captain Reginald finally said, his voice carrying a note of reluctance. You'll be stationed at the servants' entrance near the kitchen wing. Your duty is to prevent unauthorized access to that area during the ceremony. Several guards exchanged glances and Marcus could see the logic behind his assignment. The servants' entrance was considered the least important post, far from the main ceremony and unlikely to encounter any real security challenges. It was the perfect position for a guard that nobody trusted with more critical responsibilities. Yes, sir, Marcus replied respectfully. I understand my duties. What Captain Reginald didn't realize was that he had just given Marcus exactly what he needed. A position that would allow him access to the palace's less monitored areas while everyone else was focused on the formal ceremony. The servants' entrance connected to a network of corridors that led throughout the palace, including areas that were normally off-limits to guards of his rank. Thomas smirked as they prepared to take their positions. Try not to let any dangerous kitchen maid sneak past you, he said loudly enough for others to hear. We're counting on you to protect us from the threat of stolen pastries. The other guards laughed, but Marcus simply nodded seriously. I'll maintain security as ordered. As the guards dispersed to their assigned positions, Marcus made his way through the palace corridors toward the servants' entrance. The passages were busy with activity as staff members prepared for the ceremony. Servants hurried past carrying decorative flowers. Musicians transported their instruments, and kitchen workers moved platters of food toward the main dining hall. Marcus reached his assigned post and took position beside the heavy wooden door that led to the kitchen wing. From this vantage point, he could observe the flow of activity, while appearing to focus solely on his security duties. The corridor stretched in both directions, connecting to stairways that led to different levels of the palace. The sounds of the ceremony beginning echoed faintly through the stone walls, trumpets announcing the arrival of foreign dignitaries, formal proclamations read in the throne room, and the movement of many people gathering for the feast. Marcus knew that every guard with any real responsibility was now focused on those proceedings. He waited patiently for 20 minutes, establishing a pattern of routine behavior that any passing servants would remember if questioned later. He checked the door, walked a short patrol route along the corridor, and maintained the appearance of a dedicated guard performing his assigned duties. When the corridor finally emptied of regular traffic, Marcus made his move. He had memorized the palace layout during his months of service, identifying the location of the royal treasury, the private chambers of important officials, and the document archives that contained the kingdom's most sensitive information. Moving with sudden grace and confidence that would have shocked his fellow guards, Marcus slipped away from his post and began navigating the palace's interior passages. His earlier clumsiness was completely gone. replaced by the fluid movements of someone with extensive training in covert operations. The first destination was a storage room 3 floors above his assigned position. Marcus climbed a narrow servant's stairway that was rarely used except by cleaning staff. The steps were worn smooth by decades of use, and he moved silently upward without creating any sound that might alert patrolling guards. The storage room contained official uniforms for palace officials, including the distinctive robes worn by the king's personal advisors. Marcus quickly selected garments that would fit him, and changed from his guard armor into the elegant clothing of a palace administrator. The transformation was remarkable. The fumbling guard had become an authoritative-looking official who could move freely through areas normally restricted to military personnel. With his new appearance established, Marcus continued deeper into the palace. His true objective lay in the northern tower, where the kingdom's most sensitive documents were stored in a heavily secured archive. The room contained treaties with foreign nations, detailed maps of military fortifications, and correspondence between the royal family and their allies. The corridors in this section of the palace were more ornate than the areas where guards normally worked. Tapestries depicting historical battles covered the walls, and expensive carpets muffled footsteps. Marcus moved confidently through these spaces, his stolen credentials allowing him to pass occasional servants without arousing suspicion. He reached the archive entrance to find it protected by a complex lock system that had been installed just months earlier. The heavy iron door was reinforced with steel bands and secured with multiple mechanisms that required special keys held only by the highest-ranking palace officials. Marcus smiled as he examined the locks. This was exactly the kind of challenge he had been trained to handle. From hidden pockets in his borrowed robes, he produced a set of specialized tools that had been carefully concealed throughout his months of service. The lockpicks were made from specially hardened metal and designed to work with even the most sophisticated security systems. Working with steady precision, Marcus began manipulating the lock mechanisms. His fingers moved with practiced skill, feeling for the subtle resistance patterns that would indicate proper alignment. The work required complete concentration and absolute silence. Any noise might alert guards or servants in nearby areas. The first lock yielded after several minutes of careful work. Marcus felt the satisfying click as the mechanism disengaged, then moved to the second lock in the series. This one was more complex, featuring multiple tumblers that had to be aligned in precise sequence. As he worked, Marcus could hear the distant sounds of the ceremony continuing in other parts of the palace. Music and laughter echoed faintly through the stone walls, indicating that the foreign ambassadors were being properly entertained. The timing was perfect. Everyone with authority was occupied with the formal proceedings. The second lock opened with a soft, metallic sound, leaving only one final barrier between Marcus and his objective. This last lock was the most sophisticated of all, featuring a unique design that he had studied extensively during his preparation for this mission. Marcus paused to listen carefully for any approaching footsteps or voices. The corridor remained silent except for the distant celebration. Satisfied that he remained undetected, he returned his attention to the final lock with renewed focus. The specialized tools moved delicately through the mechanism as Marcus worked to understand its internal structure. This lock required not just technical skill, but also intuitive understanding of how the designers had intended it to function. Each movement had to be precise and deliberate. After what felt like an eternity but was actually only minutes, the final lock clicked open. Marcus carefully turned the heavy handle and pushed the iron door inward, revealing the archive chamber beyond. Rows of wooden shelves lined the walls filled with documents, maps, and bound volumes containing the kingdom's most guarded secrets. Marcus stepped into the archive and began his search for the specific information that had brought him to this dangerous mission. Years of planning had led to this moment, and he finally had access to the intelligence that would change everything. The incompetent guard that everyone mocked was about to accomplish something that would shake the foundations of the kingdom. Inside the archive chamber, Marcus moved with purposeful efficiency among the towering shelves of documents. Moonlight filtered through high windows, providing just enough illumination to read the labels on various sections. The air smelled of old parchment and leather bindings, carrying the weight of centuries of royal secrets. He located the section containing military correspondence and began searching for specific documents that matched descriptions he had memorized years earlier. His fingers traced along the organized files until he found a leather portfolio marked with the royal seal and dated from the previous spring. Opening the portfolio revealed exactly what he had been seeking: detailed correspondence between the current king and military commanders, discussing a secret alliance with a neighboring kingdom that was supposed to remain hidden from the public. The letters outlined plans for joint military exercises and shared intelligence operations that violated several existing treaties. Marcus carefully photographed each document using a small device concealed in his robes. The equipment was advanced for its time, capable of capturing clear images even in low-light conditions. Each photograph was a piece of evidence that would prove the king's deception to his own people and to foreign allies who had been betrayed by the secret agreements. As he worked, Marcus reflected on the path that had brought him to this moment. 3 years earlier, his younger brother had died during a military campaign that the king had publicly claimed was a peaceful diplomatic mission. The truth, which Marcus had discovered through his own investigation, was that his brother had been killed during a secret raid designed to test the defenses of a neutral kingdom. The king's lies had destroyed Marcus's family and countless others who had lost loved ones in conflicts that were never supposed to exist. His brother had believed he was serving his country honorably, never knowing that his death would serve only to advance the king's hidden political agenda. Marcus completed photographing the military correspondence and moved to another section of the archive. Here he found financial records that detailed payments to foreign mercenaries and bribes offered to officials in other kingdoms. The amounts were staggering, representing money that had been diverted from public works and social programs to fund the king's secret operations. Each document he discovered painted a clearer picture of systematic corruption and deception. The king had been presenting himself as a peaceful ruler while secretly engaging in activities that threatened the stability of the entire region. The foreign ambassadors currently attending the ceremony had no idea they were dining with someone who had been plotting against their own nations. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside caused Marcus to freeze instantly. He quickly extinguished the small light he had been using and pressed himself against the wall behind one of the larger document shelves. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by voices engaged in casual conversation. "The ceremony is going well," said a voice that Marcus recognized as belonging to one of the king's senior advisors. "The ambassadors seem impressed with our hospitality." "Indeed," replied another voice. "Though I noticed some concern from the Westmarch delegation about trade agreements. We may need to address their questions tomorrow." The voices paused directly outside the archive entrance, and Marcus held his breath while remaining perfectly still. Through a gap between document shelves, he could see shadows moving beneath the door. If the officials decided to enter the archive, his mission would end in capture and almost certain execution. "Should we review the treaty documents tonight?" the first voice asked. "I want to be prepared for any detailed questions they might raise." "No need," the second advisor replied. "The ceremony will continue for several more hours. We can handle any concerns in the morning when everyone is fresh." The footsteps resumed, moving past the archive entrance and continuing down the corridor. Marcus waited several minutes after the voices faded before emerging from his hiding place and returning to his work. The close encounter had reminded him that time was limited and discovery remained a constant threat. Focused his attention on a section containing royal decrees and proclamations that had never been made public. Among these documents, he found orders authorizing the seizure of property from families whose sons had died in the secret military operations. The king had been systematically confiscating land and valuables from grieving families under false legal pretenses. The cruelty of this discovery made Marcus's hands shake with suppressed anger. His own family's farm had been taken through similar methods, forcing his parents into poverty during their final years. He had always suspected corruption, but seeing the written proof of such calculated evil exceeded even his worst expectations. Marcus photographed these documents with special care, knowing they would be crucial for exposing the king's crimes to both foreign allies and the domestic population. The evidence was mounting into an irrefutable case that would destroy the king's carefully maintained reputation and hopefully bring justice to countless victims. Moving to the final section of his planned search, Marcus located correspondence between the king and several foreign nobles who were secretly working to destabilize their own governments. The letters revealed a complex network of conspiracy that extended far beyond the kingdom's borders, involving plots to assassinate rival leaders and manipulate succession disputes in neighboring countries. One particular letter made Marcus pause in shock. It contained detailed plans for an attack on the very delegation of foreign ambassadors who were currently attending the ceremony downstairs. The king intended to have them assassinated during their visit, then blame the murders on political enemies to justify declaring war on their kingdoms. The attack was scheduled for the following morning, just hours away. Marcus realized that his mission had become far more urgent than he had originally planned. He wasn't just gathering evidence of past crimes. He had discovered an active plot that would cost innocent lives and potentially trigger a devastating war. Working with renewed speed, Marcus photographed every relevant document he could find while constantly listening for approaching footsteps or voices. The archive contained enough evidence to not only expose the king's corruption, but also prevent an international catastrophe that could destabilize the entire region. As he prepared to leave the archive, Marcus heard the distant sounds of the ceremony beginning to wind down. Music was ending, and he could detect the movement of many people through the palace corridors as guests prepared to retire for the evening. His window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Marcus sealed the photographed documents in a waterproof container that he secured inside his robes. The evidence would be useless if he was captured before it could be delivered to the right people. He had contacts in 3 different kingdoms who were expecting his intelligence, and at least one of them needed to receive the information about tomorrow's planned assassinations. Returning the archive to its original state, Marcus ensured that no trace of his visit remained visible. He carefully locked each mechanism in reverse order, leaving the security system exactly as he had found it. Any investigation would find no obvious signs of unauthorized entry. Taking one final look around the chamber that had yielded such devastating secrets, Marcus prepared to begin the most dangerous part of his mission, escaping the palace with the evidence intact. The transformation from bumbling guard to master spy was complete, but the greatest challenges still lay ahead. The incompetent Marcus that everyone mocked was about to disappear forever, replaced by someone who held the power to change the fate of kingdoms. The only question remaining was whether he could survive long enough to use that power for justice. Marcus emerged from the archive and began making his way back through the palace corridors, moving with calculated caution through the dimly lit passages. The ceremonial robes he had stolen provided perfect camouflage among the ornate surroundings, but he knew that his window of opportunity was rapidly closing as the evening's festivities wound down. The challenge now was returning to his assigned post without arousing suspicion. He needed to resume his role as the incompetent guard before anyone noticed his absence. The servants' entrance, where he was supposed to be stationed, lay 3 floors below and halfway across the palace complex. As Marcus descended the narrow servants' stairway, he encountered a kitchen worker carrying empty platters from the ceremony. The young woman looked tired from hours of preparation and service, barely glancing at the well-dressed official passing by in the opposite direction. Her presence reminded Marcus that palace staff would soon be moving throughout the building to clean up after the celebration. Reaching the appropriate floor, Marcus slipped into an empty storage closet to change back into his guard armor. The transformation had to be quick and complete. Any detail that seemed out of place could raise questions that he couldn't afford to answer. He carefully folded the stolen robes and hid them behind stacks of cleaning supplies where they wouldn't be discovered for days. Emerging from the storage closet in his familiar guard uniform, Marcus felt the weight of his armor and weapons returning like an old friend. The photographer device and evidence container were now concealed beneath his chest plate, creating a slight bulk that he hoped would go unnoticed in the dim corridor lighting. He hurried toward his assigned post, rehearsing the story he would tell if questioned about his temporary absence. A simple tale about pursuing a suspicious noise would explain any gap in his presence at the servants' entrance. The key was maintaining his established persona of an earnest but incompetent guard who took his duties seriously, despite his obvious limitations. Marcus rounded the final corner and saw his post ahead. The heavy wooden door leading to the kitchen wing stood exactly as he had left it. The corridor was empty except for a few servants moving in the distance, their attention focused on their own tasks rather than the security arrangements. He had just resumed his position when footsteps approached from the main palace area. Captain Reginald appeared with 2 other guards, conducting what appeared to be a routine security check of all posts during the ceremony's conclusion. "Report," Captain Reginald commanded as he reached Marcus's position. "All quiet, sir," Marcus replied with appropriate formality. No unauthorized access attempts or unusual activity observed. The captain examined the door and the surrounding area with professional thoroughness. "Any movement from the kitchen staff?" "Normal activity throughout the evening," Marcus answered. "Servants moving supplies for the ceremony, but all had proper identification when I checked." Captain Reginald nodded approvingly. "Good work." The ceremony concluded successfully with no security incidents reported from any post. As the captain prepared to move on to the next checkpoint, one of the accompanying guards, a man named Peter who had always been neutral toward Marcus, spoke up with curiosity. "Did you hear any unusual sounds during the evening?" Peter asked. "I could have sworn I heard footsteps in some of the upper corridors, but when I investigated I found nothing." Marcus felt a moment of tension but kept his expression neutral. "I heard some movement earlier, sir. Investigated briefly but determined it was likely servants accessing storage areas for ceremony preparations." "That makes sense," Captain Reginald agreed. "The entire palace has been active tonight. Everyone returned to regular duties. The foreign ambassadors will be retiring soon, and will maintain elevated security until their departure tomorrow afternoon." The mention of tomorrow afternoon sent a chill through Marcus as he remembered the assassination plot he had discovered. The foreign ambassadors had no idea that their hosts were planning to murder them within hours. The evidence he had gathered could save their lives, but only if he could find a way to deliver it to the right people. After Captain Reginald's group moved on to continue their rounds, Marcus was left alone at his post with his thoughts racing. The immediate challenge of avoiding detection had been successfully overcome, but now he faced an even more complex problem. How could he warn the foreign ambassadors without revealing his true identity and compromising his mission? The palace settled into its nighttime routine as the ceremony officially ended. Servants began the extensive process of cleaning and organizing after the elaborate celebration. Guards took their positions for the night watch, and the foreign dignitaries retired to their assigned quarters in the palace's guest wing. Marcus maintained his post for another hour, observing the flow of activity and planning his next moves. The evidence he had gathered needed to reach multiple destinations. Some of it would expose the king's long-term corruption, while other documents contained information about immediate threats that required urgent action. As the palace grew quieter, Marcus realized he had one significant advantage that he hadn't fully considered. His months of service had given him detailed knowledge of the guard rotation schedules and security protocols. He knew exactly when and where the night watch would be positioned, creating opportunities for movement that wouldn't be available to an outsider. The foreign ambassadors were housed in the eastern wing of the palace, an area that Marcus had studied extensively during his reconnaissance activities. The wing featured luxury accommodations designed to impress visiting dignitaries, with each delegation assigned separate suites connected by a central common area. Marcus knew that warning the ambassadors directly would be extremely dangerous. Any contact with foreign officials would immediately mark him as a spy, resulting in arrest, torture, and execution. However, he also knew that allowing innocent people to die when he had the power to prevent it would haunt him forever. A plan began forming in his mind as he observed the changing of the guard that occurred every 2 hours. During the transition period, there would be a brief window when certain corridors were temporarily unmonitored while guards moved between positions. If he timed his actions perfectly, he could deliver anonymous warnings without revealing his identity. At midnight, Marcus prepared to implement his plan. He had written 3 identical messages on small pieces of parchment, each containing the essential information about tomorrow's assassination plot. The messages were deliberately vague about their source, simply stating that foreign ambassadors were in immediate danger and should leave the palace before dawn. The first message was intended for the delegation from the Northern Kingdom, whose ambassador had a reputation for caution and quick decision-making. Marcus had observed the man during the ceremony and noted his alertness to potential threats. If anyone would take an anonymous warning seriously, it would be him. Moving carefully through the palace corridors during the guard change, Marcus made his way toward the eastern wing. The familiar weight of his armor helped maintain his disguise, while the evidence container beneath his chest plate reminded him of the larger mission that still needed to be completed. He reached the Northern Kingdom suite just as the corridor guards completed their rotation. The new sentries were settling into their positions at distant checkpoints, leaving a brief period of reduced surveillance in the immediate area. Marcus slipped the first warning message under the ambassador's door and retreated quickly to avoid detection. The second message was for the Western Coalition's representative, a sharp-minded woman who had asked pointed questions during the ceremony about trade agreements and military cooperation. Marcus had heard her expressing subtle concerns about the king's policies, suggesting she might be receptive to information about his treachery. Delivering the second message required crossing the central common area, where a single guard maintained watch from a distant alcove. Marcus timed his movement to coincide with the guard's regular patrol pattern, slipping across the open space during a moment when the sentry's attention was focused elsewhere. The final message was intended for the Eastern Empire's delegation, whose ambassador was known for his diplomatic skills and extensive network of contacts. If the assassination plot succeeded despite Marcus's warnings, this man would be most likely to survive and carry word of the king's treachery to other kingdoms. As Marcus delivered the third warning, he heard voices approaching from an unexpected direction. Two palace officials were walking through the eastern wing, discussing arrangements for the following day's activities. Their conversation confirmed the assassination timeline. The attack would occur during a morning tour of the palace gardens, when the ambassadors would be separated from their personal guards and vulnerable to coordinated assault. Marcus pressed himself against a wall hanging and remained motionless as the officials passed by. Their casual discussion of tomorrow's schedule showed no awareness of the planned murders, indicating that knowledge of the plot was limited to the king's innermost circle. The evidence Marcus had gathered might be the only way to prevent the catastrophe. After the officials disappeared around a corner, Marcus began his return journey to his assigned post. The warning messages had been delivered, but he couldn't be certain they would be taken seriously, or that the ambassadors would have time to escape before the attacks began. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him as he made his way through the darkened corridors. He had done everything possible to warn the intended victims, but the success of his efforts remained uncertain. The larger mission of exposing the king's crimes still lay ahead, requiring him to escape the palace with the evidence intact. As Marcus resumed his position at the servants' entrance, he realized that the next few hours would determine whether his months of careful planning would result in justice or tragedy. The incompetent guard that everyone mocked had become the only person capable of preventing an international catastrophe. But the true test of his abilities was just beginning. Dawn approached with an unusual commotion in the eastern wing of the palace. Marcus remained at his post, but he could hear raised voices and hurried footsteps echoing through the stone corridors. The sound suggested that at least some of the foreign ambassadors had taken his warnings seriously and were demanding explanations. From their hosts, Captain Reginald appeared at Marcus's post earlier than expected, his face grim with concern. "There's been a development," he announced tersely. "The foreign delegations are requesting immediate departure from the palace. Something has alarmed them during the night. Should I report to a different assignment, sir?" Marcus asked, maintaining his role as an obedient but confused guard. "No, maintain your current post," the captain replied. "We're implementing enhanced security protocols until this situation is resolved." As Captain Reginald hurried away to deal with the crisis, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and growing tension. His warnings had apparently been effective. The ambassadors were trying to leave before the planned assassination could take place. However, their sudden departure would certainly alert the king's conspirators that their plot had been discovered. Throughout the morning, Marcus observed increasing activity as palace officials scrambled to manage the diplomatic crisis. Servants rushed back and forth carrying messages, and he could hear heated discussions taking place in nearby rooms. The carefully planned assassination had been disrupted, but the king would certainly suspect that someone had leaked information about the plot. Around mid-morning, Thomas appeared at Marcus's post with several other guards in tow. His usual arrogant demeanor had been replaced by suspicious alertness, and he studied Marcus with newfound interest. "Strange coincidence," Thomas said conversationally. "The foreign ambassadors suddenly decide to leave just hours before their scheduled tour of the gardens, almost as if someone warned them about something." Marcus maintained his confused expression. "I don't understand, sir. Has something happened?" "That's what we're trying to determine," Thomas replied, moving closer. "Captain Reginald wants to question all guards who were on duty last night. You'll be called for interview shortly." The interrogation threat didn't surprise Marcus. He had expected that suspicion would fall on palace personnel once the plot was disrupted. However, he was confident that his carefully maintained reputation as an incompetent guard would work in his favor. Nobody would suspect that someone so obviously inept could have executed such a sophisticated intelligence operation. An hour later, Marcus was summoned to Captain Reginald's office for questioning. The room was cramped and windowless, designed to make subjects feel uncomfortable during interrogations. The captain sat behind a wooden desk, covered with official documents, while two senior guards flanked the doorway. "Sit down, Marcus," Captain Reginald commanded, indicating a simple chair positioned directly across from his desk. "I need to ask you some questions about last night's activities." "Of course, sir," Marcus replied, settling into the chair with apparent nervousness. "I hope I didn't do anything wrong." Captain Reginald studied him carefully before beginning the formal questioning. "Did you notice any unusual activity during your watch? Anyone who shouldn't have been in your area?" "No, sir," Marcus answered promptly. "Just the normal servants and officials I've seen during previous ceremonies. Everything seemed routine." "Did you leave your post at any time during the evening?" Marcus had prepared for this question. "Briefly, sir. I heard a noise that seemed suspicious and investigated about 50 feet down the corridor. But I found nothing unusual, and returned immediately to my assigned position." The captain made notes on a piece of parchment. "How long were you away from your post?" "No more than 5 minutes, sir. I wanted to be thorough but didn't want to abandon my duties." Captain Reginald exchanged glances with the other guards before continuing. "Marcus, I'm going to ask you directly. Did you see or hear anything that might explain how information about palace security reached the foreign ambassadors?" "Information about security," Marcus repeated, looking genuinely confused. "I don't understand what kind of information they might have received." The captain leaned forward. "Someone warned the ambassadors about a threat to their safety. We need to identify who had access to that information and how it was communicated." Marcus shook his head slowly. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't know anything about warnings or threats. Should I have been watching for something specific?" The questioning continued for another 20 minutes, with Captain Reginald probing for any inconsistencies in Marcus's story. However, his reputation for incompetence worked perfectly as a shield against suspicion. The captain clearly found it difficult to imagine that such an obviously inept guard could have been involved in sophisticated espionage activities. "That's all for now," Captain Reginald finally said. "Return to your duties, but remain available for additional questions if needed." Marcus stood and saluted awkwardly. "Yes, sir. I hope you find whoever is responsible." As he left the interrogation room, Marcus could hear Captain Reginald speaking to his colleagues. "It's not him," the captain said with certainty. "He barely has the intelligence to follow basic orders, let alone conduct covert operations." The assessment stung Marcus's pride, but he recognized it as validation that his cover remained intact. The months of enduring mockery and contempt had established a persona so convincing that even direct questioning couldn't shake it. Returning to his post, Marcus found the palace atmosphere increasingly tense. Word had spread that the foreign ambassadors were accusing their hosts of planning treachery, creating a diplomatic crisis that threatened relationships with multiple kingdoms. Palace officials were working frantically to contain the damage while secretly searching for the source of the intelligence leak. By afternoon, Marcus learned that the foreign delegations had successfully departed the palace under heavy guard. The assassination plot had been completely thwarted, saving innocent lives and preventing the international war that would have followed. However, the king's reaction to this failure was becoming increasingly dangerous for everyone in the palace. Rumors circulated among the guards that several palace officials had been arrested on suspicion of treason. The king was reportedly furious, about the security breach and had ordered a comprehensive investigation to identify anyone who might have access to sensitive information. Marcus realized that his window for escaping with the evidence was rapidly closing. The enhanced security measures would make it much more difficult to leave the palace undetected, and the ongoing investigation increased the risk of discovery with each passing hour. That evening, as darkness settled over the palace grounds, Marcus began implementing the final phase of his mission. The evidence he had gathered needed to reach his contacts in foreign kingdoms, but first he had to survive long enough to deliver it. The incompetent guard that everyone dismissed was about to attempt the most dangerous escape of his career. The transformation from Marcus the bumbling recruit to Marcus the master spy was nearly complete. All that remained was proving that his carefully planned mission could succeed despite the extraordinary risks involved. The stakes had never been higher, and failure would mean not just his own death but the continued suffering of countless innocent people under the king's corrupt rule. As midnight approached, Marcus prepared for the most critical phase of his mission. The palace was under heightened security due to the diplomatic crisis, but he had identified a narrow window of opportunity during the changing of the night watch. His months of observation had revealed a 15-minute gap when the outer perimeter would be temporarily undermanned. Moving with the confidence of someone who belonged in the palace, Marcus made his way toward the servants' quarters where he had hidden supplies for his escape. The corridors were dimly lit by scattered torches, creating pools of dancing shadows that provided cover for his movements. In a storage room near the kitchen wing, Marcus retrieved a leather satchel containing civilian clothes, travel documents, and currency that he had accumulated over his months of service. The evidence container was carefully transferred from beneath his armor to a specially designed compartment in the satchel, ensuring that the precious photographs would remain protected during his journey. The transformation from palace guard to traveling merchant took only minutes. Marcus exchanged his armor for simple brown robes and a worn cloak that would help him blend in with common travelers. A false beard and hair dye altered his appearance enough to avoid immediate recognition, while maintaining the unremarkable look of someone beneath notice. Emerging from the storage room, Marcus began navigating toward the palace's outer walls using routes that avoided the main guard posts. His knowledge of the building's layout allowed him to move through sections that were normally restricted to cleaning staff and maintenance workers. The sound of approaching footsteps caused him to duck into an alcove as two guards passed by on their patrol route. Marcus recognized their voices, Thomas and Gerald discussing the ongoing investigation into the intelligence leak that had disrupted the assassination plot. Whoever warned those ambassadors had to be someone with access to high-level information, Thomas was saying. Captain Reginald thinks it might have been one of the king's advisors. Maybe, Gerald replied skeptically. But how would they have delivered warnings without being detected? The whole eastern wing was under surveillance. Their conversation faded as they continued their patrol, leaving Marcus alone in the darkened corridor. The irony wasn't lost on him that his former tormentors were discussing his actions without having any idea of his true capabilities. Marcus reached the outer courtyard just as the guard change began. From his hiding place behind a storage shed, he watched the night watch personnel move between their assigned positions. The timing had to be perfect. Too early and he would encounter guards still on duty. Too late, and the new watch would already be in position. The critical moment arrived as the last of the departing guards disappeared into the palace, and before the new sentries reached their posts. Marcus sprinted across the open courtyard, staying low and moving toward a section of the outer wall, where he had previously identified a weakness in the stonework. The wall was 12 feet high and topped with iron spikes, but Marcus had prepared for this obstacle. Hidden tools allowed him to create handholds in the mortar between stones, and a rope with grappling hooks helped him navigate the spiked barrier at the top. As he dropped silently to the ground outside the palace walls, Marcus felt a surge of relief mixed with anticipation. The most dangerous part of his mission was complete. He had successfully infiltrated the palace, gathered crucial evidence, prevented an international catastrophe, and escaped without being detected. The road ahead led to the port city of Westmarch, where ships departed regularly for foreign kingdoms. Marcus had established contact procedures with agents from 3 different nations, each of whom would receive copies of the evidence he had gathered. The king's crimes would be exposed simultaneously across multiple kingdoms, making it impossible to suppress or deny the information. During the 3-day journey to Westmarch, Marcus traveled as an unremarkable merchant carrying samples of grain for trade negotiations. He stopped at roadside inns where he overheard conversations about the diplomatic crisis at the palace, learning that news of the disrupted assassination plot was already spreading throughout the region. At Westmarch Port, Marcus delivered the evidence to his waiting contacts through a series of carefully orchestrated meetings. Each agent received different portions of the documentation, ensuring that even if some deliveries were intercepted, enough information would reach foreign capitals to expose the king's treachery. The first contact was a merchant ship captain who regularly sailed to the northern kingdom. Marcus passed him photographs of the military correspondence that revealed secret alliances and illegal raids. The captain's grim expression showed that he understood the significance of the documents. The second delivery went to a diplomat's courier who was returning to the Western Coalition. This package contained evidence of the financial corruption and property seizures that had enriched the king at the expense of his own people. The courier promised that the information would reach the highest levels of the coalition's government within days. The final contact was the most dangerous, a representative of the Eastern Empire who operated under deep cover in the port city. Marcus met him in the basement of a seemingly abandoned warehouse, where he delivered the most damning evidence of all: complete documentation of the assassination plot and the king's network of foreign conspirators. "This information will change everything," the agent said as he examined the photographs. "Multiple kingdoms have suspected treachery, but we've never had proof this comprehensive." Marcus nodded grimly. The people deserve to know what their king has been doing in their name. The families who lost loved ones in secret wars deserve justice. With the evidence successfully delivered, Marcus faced a choice about his own future. He could disappear entirely, creating a new identity in a distant kingdom where the king's agents would never find him. Alternatively, he could return to observe the consequences of his actions and help coordinate the response to the revelations he had made possible. The decision was easier than he had expected. Marcus realized that his mission wasn't truly complete until the king faced justice for his crimes. The evidence would create enormous pressure for accountability, but ensuring that pressure translated into meaningful change would require continued effort. 3 weeks later, as reports of international investigations and domestic unrest reached the palace, Captain Reginald noticed that the guard, Marcus, had never returned from a routine assignment. The bumbling, incompetent recruit had simply vanished without explanation, leaving behind only questions about where such an obviously inept person might have gone. Thomas and the other guards who had mocked Marcus quickly forgot about him, assuming he had quit in shame after being unable to handle the responsibilities of palace service. None of them ever suspected that the laughingstock of the guard unit had been responsible for the greatest intelligence coup in the kingdom's history. The king's reign crumbled within months as evidence of his crimes spread across multiple kingdoms. Foreign allies withdrew their support, domestic protests demanded his abdication, and military commanders refused to follow orders from a ruler they now knew to be treacherous and corrupt. In the end, the silent guard who had endured months of ridicule and contempt had achieved something that armies and diplomats had failed to accomplish. Justice had been served not through violence or political maneuvering, but through the patient gathering of truth and the courage to act when action was needed most. Marcus had proven that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one that nobody takes seriously. The quiet observer who sees everything, remembers everything, and waits for exactly the right moment to strike back against injustice. His true aim had never been to become a respected guard, but to become the instrument of justice that his brother and countless others deserved.